Okay, so I am Lon.TV, as I said. I have a channel called Lon.TV on YouTube, and you can find me there. I cover retro stuff occasionally. In fact, just last night I posted a video about the MiSTer and a new little device that I got, and I'm joined by...
I'm Bob, the founder of RetroRGB and a fan of Lon's, so I'm very lucky to be up here. Thank you for having me again.
Thanks for coming and for being drafted on. So Bob is my fact checker, so as I'm like spewing nonsense, he will correct me. But we did this panel about 2 years ago, the last time we had a RetroWorldExpo, and at that point, people weren't all that familiar with what the MiSTer was all about. So what we thought we would do is kind of do a brief overview of what it is if you're looking to buy one. And then we'll get into kind of the more advanced topics and take your questions as we go. Now, there's a lot of debate over whether or not this is better than a Raspberry Pi or whatever. And my position on this is that, because I cover a lot of different types of tech, and believe it or not, even when I review things like printers, there's always like this brand loyalty and people like one thing versus the other. And for me, I'm happy when people find the thing that works for them. And so for me, the MiSTer really is something, as a person that grew up with retro computers and retro game consoles. I'm a child of the 80s, so I had the Atari 2600 and the Apple II. My friends had the Commodores. And what I love about the MiSTer is that it's given me a way to explore a lot of what I missed as a kid and re-experience the things that I did have as a kid. So those are the things that kind of really attracted me to this platform. And as you'll see as we work our way through some of the hardware here, there are ways in which not only does it replicate things quite well, but it actually displays things accurately on a CRT television. And that's his ballywick here. So to do a MiSTer, you don't have to spend a lot to get going. In fact, if you buy just the DE10 Nano board, which is the base of the MiSTer project, you can get started with a number of the cores without having to buy anything else. You can't run everything. But there are a lot of things that just run with a straight-up DE10 Nano out of the box and an SD card. The MiSTer project has a great website and a guide to get you going. They have these great scripts that update everything. And one of the fun things about the MiSTer is that if I put it down for 2 or 3 months and come back to it, suddenly it's like a whole new device because everything gets updated. You run the script, you walk away for 10 minutes, and when you come back, you've got more treasures of the 80s available to you. And I think one of the neat things to think about how this works is that this has an FPGA processor on board. And so when these cores are written, they are replicating, correct me here, they are replicating the logic and the circuitry of the original hardware. So if you think about preservation, we want to preserve software, and we can do that and have been doing it for 20-something years. The MAME project has been great about that software preservation side and the emulation side. But you also have to remember that a lot of the hardware was made custom for each of these computers and arcade cabinets. So you have a situation where we have the software largely preserved, but the logic and the circuitry of the original hardware is kind of at risk of fading away if we're not diligent about bringing these things back. So MiSTer kind of completes the circle in that the cores that you load on program that FPGA processor to conduct itself exactly the same way that the original hardware did. The same circuit paths are put into place. And if I'm not mistaken, a few of the cores have been, people burning off chips to get the logic?
Yeah, they're so accurate that just recently a developer from Canada, Stephanie Allaire, took the FM chip, audio chip core and put it on a much less powerful FPGA than that, and you could plug it directly into any device that used the original. So it's that accurate that you could use it to replace the original chips on any motherboard that used it.
So there are people that actually look at the circuits that are in the chip, things that they photographically burned into the silicon to make these cores. And you can have bad cores that don't work at all, or bad cores that don't work accurately, but when it's done right, it's great. And I think what works here with the MiSTer project is that the code is modular to some degree. So when somebody makes a 6502 processor, there's a team that can focus on that processor and make it better. And when it gets better, everyone's cores benefit. And so that's the kind of thing that I think separates this from a Raspberry Pi or something else, and it's also why it's more expensive. But if you're looking for the best experience and to know you have the best, I think this is the best, but it doesn't mean the other solutions aren't good. And if you think about it, the old Commodore, even the things as old as the Commodore 64 are massively parallel devices. You have the SID chip, whatever that does. You've got the 6502. All these things have to work in concert. And one of the things about FPGAs, you'll find them in your car. They can do a lot of parallel processing. They use them for video encoders. The big fancy Mac card that you can buy for $10,000 is an FPGA. So DE10 Nano is kind of the heart of this. It is made by a company called Terasic?
Terasic.
And not that expensive, 170-ish bucks. Expensive for what it looks like, but for what it is, it's not that bad. And then, if you want to have complete compatibility, you buy 128 megabytes of SDRAM, 50, 60 bucks, give or take?
I believe so, yeah.
It's the most you'll pay for that amount
With
of
the
RAM.
part shortage, who knows when the prices are going to vary, but yeah, about that.
And so when you've got the SDRAM and you have the DE10 Nano, you can run everything. Everything works. So you can add on things to it later, but the RAM and the DE10 Nano, you're good to go. Now there's some optional stuff you can get. You have a I/O board, which I have on the top of my unit right here. And what this does is it allows you to output to a CRT provided you have an RGB input on it, a component input.
Either one, yeah.
And so, Bob, is it easy to get a regular old TV working with this setup, or it's a little harder?
It's actually easier to get, as long as your TV has component video inputs, which here in the US, you would see that over or any of the other higher end inputs. That's very easy. All you would need is a VGA to component cable, not a converter, just a little pass-through cable that passes it. You could also output RGB or VGA through this. So even if you had just like an old Dell VGA CRT monitor, you could plug that directly into it as well.
So, and if I had like a TV without a component input, what would I have to do?
So there are different I/O boards out there now that are trying to address this. There's one that outputs S-Video via a Saturn S-Video cable, and that works perfectly. None of them will work right at the moment with composite video because you need to dial in the signal, and I have a prototype of one where you could do just that. You output composite video and then you turn a little dial until it looks right. But at the moment, the lowest you could consistently go is S-Video. But that's probably going to change in the next year.
So if you don't have a component input, it does take a little bit more work. It's not as simple as plugging it into the RCA composite jack on
Correct.
the... Right,
I'm hoping at some point you will get exactly that. Just a little yellow cable, any CRT in the world, but we're not there yet for that one.
So hopefully at some point some doodad will come out to, do that.
Exactly.
And I'll say I was lucky because my father had called me one day and he said, hey, I'm renovating the house. I'm getting rid of this CRT TV. Do you want it? And I said, yeah, I'll take it. And it sat up in my little game room for 3 years. And one day I was looking for something behind it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I got a component input on this sucker. So I went out and bought that cable. I plugged it in, and it was like, holy crap. And I had the MiSTer now for 1.5 years, and it became a whole new device to me because you can load up a Commodore 64, and it looks like what it looked like back when I was a kid, but better, because now you've got your colors crisp and separated properly, not mushed together. The NES looks great on it. I'll show you some footage in a second. You also have a few other things that are optional that you might want to add on as well. And there's one other thing you can do with the I/O board, which I'll talk about in a minute. I have a USB hub on the bottom of mine, and it's just convenient to have that because you get, 6 or 7 USB ports on the bottom of your MiSTer. And you'll want to have those because you'll want to hook up an external hard drive like I have here. You'll want to connect your game controllers with USB. Because you might want the lowest possible latency when you are on that CRT television, for example. So you can use any USB hub with it, but having it in the stack makes a lot of sense for me. So that'll add a little bit of cost if you want to go that route. There are some cases available, which I would recommend because you got a lot of bare circuits on here that are probably sensitive to wintertime, right? And then another thing that I just got the other day is something called a SNAC, which is a device that plugs into, there's a USB looking port on the I/O board. And that port actually is not a USB port, but a serial port for the SNAC. And when you connect that, you can hook up light guns and other regular game controllers to the MiSTer. Now the light guns will not work, and I just did a full video on this you can check out on my channel. The light guns won't work with an HDMI television, but they will work on a CRT provided you've got the component input and you can plug in the thing. And so I was able to do that. I can show you a video of that real quick. The other day, who remembers this game? This was Freedom Force. And so I had this hooked up to my TV. This was using the NES core. And it was just as good as the original. And in fact, it was better because the video quality out of the RGB looked great. So the zapper worked fine. I actually was like, you'll see in a minute, I aim off the target just to make sure it wasn't just registering everything. And it seemed to work great. And this is another little thing that you can add on to your MiSTer over time. So you don't have to, again, do everything all at once if you don't want to. So that's kind of the hardware overview. And after you get these pieces together, you're ready to go. And like I said, you can do the RAM and the MiSTer itself, and or the DE10 Nano, and you're pretty much ready to go. So what I thought I would do here, let me get my keyboard out. One thing I recommend too is having a keyboard available, because it's just easier sometimes to navigate. How do you navigate yours, Bob? What do you usually do?
I have a USB keyboard exactly like yours, and in the MiSTerCade, because you could build these into arcade machines too, I have it all locked down so that you can't really mess with anything, so it never changes.
Right, so let me pull up our list here. So what I thought I would do is just kind of briefly go through some of the things you can run on it in case you're not familiar with it or you haven't looked at it in a while. So there's a lot of arcade games that have made their way here. Bob, there's some new developments, right? So the Capcom games have been some of the more recent ones?
Yeah, there's always new cores being added. And just a quick aside, anytime you hear the word new core being added, especially when it comes to arcade games, they are recreating the hardware of each arcade board. So with the consoles, it's still complicated, but once you get it, then you just load up, the hundreds of ROMs for each console. But every arcade board needs to be recreated from scratch via the software that this stuff runs. So it's very impressive to see what the team behind it has done.
And a lot of this stuff runs on your CRT television. So for example, we can boot up Street Fighter 2 here. And hopefully my MiSTer cooperates. Sometimes it gets a little crazy. And this all looks familiar, right? You can see the thing on your emulators and stuff, but there's something special about it when you get that title screen on your CRT television in your house. As a kid, like that's what we all wanted. We got close to it with the SNES versions and the Genesis and the 3DOs and stuff, but it just looks amazing. It looks amazing in HDMI. You do have filters. There's a lot of stuff you can do to refine the image. I typically, and I went off, Bob, what Smoke Monster likes, which is like one of the basic ones. Which ones do you like to use for the
There are brand new filters coming out that are on par with what you see in some of the newer scalers, like the RetroTink 5X. So those are still in progress, but those really recreate what the look of a CRT is. Very impressive.
And it doesn't add any latency or anything.
Zero latency added with all of these features.
So there's a lot you can do here just on your HDMI TV, even if you can't get the RGB going with it. And what's neat is that if you are doing RGB, you can output HDMI simultaneously. So if you're a streamer and you wanted to show like a night of NES Lightgun games, you could do that very easily without having to try to get your camera in sync with your CRT. Sound works great. I don't have the sound hooked up right now because that was like 12 other cables I have to bring. But it's just as accurate as you can be here. And it's such a labor of love, I think, in what goes into it. And if you want to switch cores, you can just go back out to your menu here and load up something different. One thing that you'll run into on a number of games is that a lot of these games would have the display orientation in Tate mode, or as our friends at GameStack would say, what, Tate mode?
Tate mode.
Tate mode. I can't wait to meet that guy. I want to just do that to him. So for example, like I don't know if Zaxxon's one of these games that's oriented that way, but you could have a game like Zaxxon, presuming that it is. When you load it up, your TV is going to display it the way the arcade TV did, because this is circuits here. So as far as I know, on the RGB, you cannot rotate the screen.
No, because that would add about a frame of lag.
Right.
And I think they're thinking about a mode to do that, but they're trying to keep it as the RGB output they want to be as original as possible, because usually the enthusiast that would have the equipment.
Right.
But the HDMI side, there's a million options to rotate. Even if you have a monitor where you could actually rotate your flat screen, you could switch it back and forth. So you have every option you need.
So if you do hook it up to your RGB television and it's the wrong way, you have to just turn your TV over. Okay, so if you got those little ones that you got, those no problem. But my big one, forget it. So sometimes it's a little more tricky than that, but it works. So there's a lot of arcade stuff. It keeps getting updated. The cool thing with the arcades is that when you run the update script, you just get everything. So there's not a lot of hunting around for stuff. Everything just gets put into your menu here and it works. And it's kind of nerve-wracking to me sometimes as a real tech control freak. I like to know what's going on. But the nice thing about the MiSTer is that it's kind of its own thing to me, so I'm okay with things getting updated on their own and knowing that it's just going to work when I get in there. They've been able to do that quite well. Consoles are pretty extensive at this point. You get all the original Atari consoles. The Lynx is on here. My favorite from a kid is the ColecoVision, which works great. So when you see that on a CRT again, because my ColecoVision's long since dead. I've been playing it in emulation for decades. To get that screen up again is just awesome, because it just was something my friends and I would just play, for months on end. So that was like the popular game console in the neighborhood. They've got Game Boy. One thing that's really neat, and I'll show you a video of this, is they have something called Game Boy 2P. I learned about this on your website. Why don't you talk about it while I get the screen to work again?
So the developer, Robert Pipe, who did the core for the Game Boy, or worked on it, plus he did the Game Boy Advance core and a bunch of other stuff, worked on a way to get 2 players simultaneously. And depending on the core, so Game Boy versus Game Boy Advance, you could have 2 people playing on the same TV. You could have the analog output having one player and the HDMI output having the other player. And it's a really cool way to experience 2-player Game Boy games without having to have matching Game Boys, the link cable, 2 cartridges, and all that stuff. It works perfect, 0 lag.
And what you're looking at here, basically, Bob, if I'm not mistaken, is that they've basically taken 2 Game Boy cores, which are, again, replications of the circuitry. And Game Boy, of course, had a circuit, I guess you could call it that, right? That connects one Game Boy to the other with a serial cable. So that serial cable is kind of being simulated in a way that these cores feel like, hey, they're plugged in together.
Exactly. I mean, imagine this is a very stupid analogy, but imagine the Terminator 2 Liquid Terminator turning itself into 2 Game Boys with a cable connecting between them. It's both a ridiculous analogy and kind of perfect to what's going on right here.
And it's funny, you're the top search result on Google for this. So when I looked at this up last night, I was like, oh, Bob's got it under.
It's very embarrassing when I Google the answer to something and an article I wrote pops up.
Yeah, right. So. That's what happens in our advanced age. And what was fun about just shooting this footage was that I hadn't seen this screen in like 25 years, right? Because you had to have a friend with a Game Boy. It wasn't easy to do. So now you can play Game Boy the way it was meant to be. It's pretty neat. So the GBA is on here, both in 2-player versions and 1-player versions. Sega Genesis, the Mega CD. The Neo Geo is pretty amazing on this too. And this is one where they just who did this core?
Oh. I think this might have been a collaboration, and I think a bunch of different people tweaked it towards the end. I can't remember who did the original core, but a lot of people in the community were jumping on that. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. I know the MiSTer team sometimes gets mad at me when I get my facts wrong, but I do know that a lot of other people have contributed, and things like Furtek, a developer who does some of that decapping. A lot of the chips he worked on, that code was backported. I know Risha has done work on this before, so yeah, it's a very cool core. It works well. And
everything is perfect, right down to the slowdown in some of these games. It's funny because when you look at some of these Neo Geo games, our memories of it as children or as young people was that this is like the pinnacle of power. And you play something like Metal Slug and you see a lot of slowdown, and I was thinking, is this core right? And sure enough,
dead accurate,
right? Yeah. So it's one of those things. But again, this is another thing that works on the CRT also. So if you ever really wanted to get a feel for what this was like back in its time, you have the ability to do that. And one thing to notice too is just how quickly you can jump between systems here. So we have Neo Geo. I can go to the SNES here just with a key press. It loads in the thing here, and if I had games on that thing, I could do it. The TurboGrafx 16 core now supports the CD games.
Yeah, that's actually a good point because so I know a lot of people that have original core graphics or TurboGrafx 16. A lot of them even use the CD modules, but they never got super graphics because it's a lot of money to spend on something for just a small handful of games. So I know a bunch of people that bought the MiSTer just to play super graphics games because it was cheaper than finding a super graphics out in the wild. So.
And I remember, so I have a funny story about the super graphics. When I was a kid, I had a cable access TV show. And I covered video. I should have stuck with it because I would not be like that commodity guy like on YouTube. But I did a show about video games. And I started it because I bought a copy of Game Players magazine at the mall. And one of the people I did a 2-page spread was this company called the something video game club, and they happened to be right. What's that?
Was it the
Ultimate Game Club? Yes. Yep. Thank you. The Ultimate Game Club, and they happened to be in the town next over from me. So I'm thinking like, hey, I'm starting a show about video games, and like these guys had all of the mysterious technology from Japan. And I walked in there one day, and they agreed to let me record stuff. It was great for them. And I brought my camcorder, my big VHS camcorder, and plugged it into their thing, and they had a super graphics there, and it was like, whoa, this is like really amazing. But there was only like 5 or 6 games that ever came out for it. But if you go on my channel, I have an interview with the general manager of the store. He came on, so you see me in a suit at 13 years old interviewing this guy about what's 1990 going to bring. But again, another console that's kind of lost to time that has been accurately replicated here. It does CD stuff as well. So for example, the Castlevania game here, I don't think I have all my controls mapped, but I had this hooked up to my stereo system. The music on this is amazing because it's all arranged, Redbook audio and stuff. And it all just runs perfectly. And you can just jump from one to the other. And I think about like what the kid that had the cable TV show would have been like if I had this, And now I'm like 45 years old, I got 2 kids and I'm busy and I can never have time to play video games anymore. And I've got like every game ever in my life sitting in this thing that I can play. You can see some of the systems there. What about PlayStation, Bob? Like there's like where's the limit? Like where do you think we cannot go any further?
I mean, definitely not anything like PlayStation 3. Anything that outputted HDMI at the moment is probably not feasible, but PlayStation 1 core is coming along really, really fast. The same developer that did the Game Boy Advance core, Robert Pipe, was working on that one. There's another team working on that as well, so I'm not, I think that's some happy, friendly competition there, but the end result, it's all open source. So it doesn't really matter who gets it, because it's all gonna be shared and used to make it better anyway. And the Sega Saturn core, the developer working on that just had another update posted where it's starting to look good.
And that amazes me, like how do you get Sega Saturn to fit on that chip? Because one of the things that you run into with FPGAs is that there's actually a physical size limitation, that you need a chip with enough room on it, enough of these logic cores. Is that the right term, logic cores? CLUs. That if you have enough CLUs to do a certain system. So the MiSTer is the sequel to the MiST, and the MiST had a smaller FPGA on board, so it could barely handle the Sega Genesis. I think it was able to do the graphics, but not the sound. So this one has enough to do the Neo Geo and perhaps the Sega Saturn, but there's a lot of chips on the Saturn.
Yeah.
But if you want an accurate replication, that's going to be, there's some really good emulators out now for sure. But I think the MiSTer will get it there. And the computer stuff is amazing too. So there's a 486 core that'll give you, what, a 486-ish computer?
Yeah, DX30 or something? Yeah. I'm probably getting that wrong, but it's fast enough where everybody that follows me knows I love Mortal Kombat, and they were joking like, hey, if you want a Mortal Kombat 2 on your MiSTer, you could play the 486 PC version of it. And I was laughing so hard, like that is the coolest, nerdiest thing I could possibly think of.
Yeah, you can actually run Windows 95 on it too. Let me reset it here and see if I can get it to work. Now last year we did Windows 3.1, because you couldn't get 95 to work at that point, but and it'll run a lot of DOS games. I know that there's a project, and maybe you're familiar with the MT32 thing?
Yes.
So now, so the Roland MT32. Anyone not know what that is? So back in my day as a PC gamer, that was like the best music you could get out of your games. But how do you make it work? You need a Raspberry Pi or something? How does that?
Yeah, so it's a bit complicated because you need another thing that plugs into it. But it is very accurate. If anybody wants to know details about it, Artemio, who's a very well-regarded member of the retro gaming community, just did a podcast with one of the people that worked on it to go into detail of what it is and how it works. But it's a pretty perfect recreation of that, of something that was like unobtainable for us back in the day.
And unfortunately, it looks like our core is going to fail us at the moment. But sometimes, just like the original DOS days, things never usually work right. So it really is a very true DOS experience, and it's not always the fault of the core. It's
the core is probably running perfect.
Yeah,
that's probably just what that's like for,
Yeah, it's just something going on that just is messing it up. I had this inkling to try to see if I could get onto Telnet BBSs with it. So I went out and just dug around looking for old DOS terminal software. And I was able to get they have a virtual UART, long story, but you could get Telnet BBSs to work through your MiSTer in AO486. And what's neat about it is that back in those days when you were on a BBS on a DOS computer, it was a full screen experience, right? You get those beautiful colors, all the ANSI graphics, and you can get that again on here because you're running, pretty much a 4x3 square image here that isn't sitting in a window. It's running at the speed that those sites kind of ran at, depending on your modem. So it's a great way to explore that. And then one night I was actually able to get calls to come into it. So I used to run a Maximus I'm such a nerd. I used to run a Maximus BBS back in the day. Did you ever go on BBS?
Oh, of course.
We probably crossed paths. We're two Connecticut people.
Most likely, yeah, at some point. Sorry if I was an asshole as a little kid.
That's right. Everyone on BBSs had their moments, but I was too. I was a moderator of a FidoNet Echo once. So,
oh, geez.
Yeah, I was. I became a bit of a tyrant. I had actually somebody call me to say you got to tone it down a little bit. So I was able actually to dial in over Telnet into the system. So there's a lot that, because it works the way it does, that you can do that. The Apple II core has been getting a lot of love lately. So now it does the Apple IIe. Before it was just Apple II Plus, so now you can actually use upper and lowercase characters on it.
Play Oregon Trail.
Yeah, Oregon Trail. There's some great packages that you can download. There's a very active Apple II community that's done a lot of software preservation. So if you play with the Apple as a kid, you've got all your favorite educational titles like Where in the USA is Carmen Sandiego and everything else. And if you note, as we're jumping around systems here, you can just see how quickly it switches. And that's been some of the things that I've loved the most about this, is that there's no friction, because what you're doing is you're loading in logic into this, into this FPGA, and it's just executing. It's just a very fast experience. And for me, honestly, like when my kids actually go to bed early, this is what I really like to explore, because I had an Apple II. My friends had Commodores. Some of my friends had Amigas and Atari STs, and I never really had a lot of time with those systems. And to be able to kind of connect into those communities and see what is out there software-wise, and start running, demos on the Commodore 64, for example, to see that scene, that's all stuff that you can start exploring and understanding better. I think you can also do BBS'ing on the Commodore. And there are actual Commodores that are still running today with BBS systems on the internet that you can connect up with. Yeah.
Have you seen the 6-part BBS documentary that's on YouTube?
Yes, the Jason Scott one.
I'm like halfway through.
It's great. Actually, if you're looking for a really good look at that world, that's a great documentary. Did you see the ANSI artwork part? So I think it's like a little bit later into the series. But it's a 6-part documentary by a guy named Jason Scott, who's very big in the retro computing scene. He actually works for the Internet Archive. And he's the guy that collects all this stuff. Like any kind of digital whatever, he just ingests it. And he did a great documentary on what the BBS scene was like. There were at one point on the FidoNet 20 or 30,000 computers that were basically hopscotching data to each other. So my system would connect to a system in the next town over. He was the regional hub. So I would send messages into there, and then it would go, and in a day it would go around the world. Just one phone call to the other. Mom was not happy with the phone bill, but she was glad I was doing that and not drugs or something. So she was she was willing to put up with the phone bill. So
definitely leave a link to that documentary, because I imagine people watching this after the fact would be like, "Oh, I want to watch that afterwards."
Definitely put it in there. Yeah, but it's amazing because you get a real appreciation for for what went on there. They got a great Mac Plus thing working here. It doesn't look like it's working, but it really does. So you can boot up. There we go. Oh, now I got to put in a disk here.
It's funny, screens like that on the original CRT monitors just looked like loading screens, and then you see them on modern digital technology, and it's like, is the core broken? Oh no, wait, that's just how it's supposed to look.
Yeah, that's how it's supposed to work. So here we go. I have a disk image here we can boot up here real quick. Let's see if it boots this time. But yeah, you just find a good image. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So just like the original, oh, there it goes. It's Happy Mac. And the image looks a little bit weird because of how the scaling is going through the projector, but. And they run, at the speed that they ran back then. And a Mac is another good example. It's a 68,000 processor, so this processor is likely used in the Amiga and the Sega Genesis, and this gets better when the processor part gets better. So, that's the kind of stuff that you get with it. But my mouse is working, so it's just fun to even to dive into the computing part, because there's just so much that you probably did not experience at a time, and now you can. Again, it works on the CRT. So that's kind of the overview of some of the things that I like about it. Again, it's a bit more costly, But I think, if I had to pick a differentiator, I would have to say, disagree with me if feel free, but I think the RGB output is the big, for no other reason, that to me is like a big differentiator, because it's not some scaled thing coming out of a Raspberry Pi that's going through some crazy processing. It is coming out just like these original systems did. Real time.
I would say if you have an RGB monitor, that would probably be the #1 thing. But I think one small step above that is the accuracy of a lot of these cores. Because there's already, in fact, we were just talking yesterday about how there's going to be a fighting game tournament run off of a MiSTer soon, because the cores got that accurate that even the top 1% of players cannot tell the difference. There's no, if you set it up properly, there's no input latency. Everything is, even down to the bug exploits that fighting game players will use doing it. I mean, it is exactly like the original for a lot of them. And I think that's the #1 thing, is while software emulation could be amazingly accurate and could do things that the hardware, real hardware, meaning also FPGAs, could never do, it's not always the same. Sometimes you could call it better, but the accuracy of it, I mean, that's the coolest thing. I mean, especially for games that, like, if, arcade board collectors, that's great if you want to do that for yourself when you want to restore them and keep them. But if you're running tournaments and you're bringing 5 arcade boards, and what if one of those snaps in your bag on your way, you're out $1,000, and whereas a bag of 5 MiSTers,
right, in
totally
a case,
different.
right?
Yeah.
Like my little MiSTer here is probably a little bit more at risk, but still, if the MiSTer breaks, you're not losing a piece of history either. It's
replaceable.
Replaceable.
Whereas good luck trying to find like a full CPS3 kit, with HDMI out and all that other stuff. So there's a developer named Totego that is, somebody from the fighting game community donated a CPS3 board, and I'm just mailing it to him now to take a look at, and he thinks he could make that work. There's been some speculation that the Nintendo DS might have worked, but I don't think so. I think in its current form, it wouldn't run a full speed core. So that's definitely probably a cap limit there. I don't think PlayStation 2 would do it. I don't think Dreamcast, but I think anything before that would probably be doable. It just takes people willing to put the time in to do it. And sometimes it's a matter of just finding the time and taking the information, but other times it involves full from scratch reverse engineering. So I think the ceiling for that would like 90s and earlier would probably be the latest that I would say, and with the exception of the Game Boy Advance, because that was 2000s. But for now, that's what I would say in the current hardware form, and just people taking the time to do it.
I think what will happen too over time is these FPGAs get less expensive. I think you'll see this project kind of morph into different base hardware, as the base point. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the code for FPGAs is pretty portable. So if there is another, was it Verilog? Is that the language?
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go from a small one to a big one. So it's not like the world doesn't end if the DE10 Nano goes away. It just might get more expensive if there's no other alternative. But you have to maybe get into a more expensive, base board to start with. And it's been funny about this too. And I'm sorry to go off track here, but the Terrasig, who makes the board, has never acknowledged this use case. They offer this as it's kind of, is the price subsidized, Bob?
The cost is subsidized, which is why, like, if you were to just buy that chip off a DigiKey or Mauser, it would be more expensive than the entire kit itself. It's subsidized because it's used as an educational tool. And Terrasig themselves have even acknowledged that this MiSTer project is an extremely useful education tool, because just because we use it for video games doesn't mean that other people aren't going to use it to be able to take what they've learned and apply it to their day jobs. So this is a nerd gateway drug like no other. For
exactly.
people.
And all this code is open source. So this is the other thing, is that although the DE10 Nano itself is a closed source piece of hardware, most of the MiSTer project hardware is open. All of the source code for the cores themselves mostly is open.
All open.
All open. So you could download this, run it into Verilog. Is that what they're using? And HDL. You can start looking at how this circuit stuff works. I have no idea, but I think they see a real value to that. But what's funny was that they've never acknowledged the use case. You go on Amazon, all you read about on the reviews for this is like MiSTer. Although I guess there was a They did send out a communication about support requests, I think, or something.
Yeah, they did acknowledge it from make sure if you're using the MiSTer project, make sure you're using quality components, and don't send the DE10 Nano back because it's broken if you're using bad components, which echoes what all of the nerds out here has been telling everybody forever. Don't jump on and buy the cheapest thing. Buy from reputable vendors.
And that's actually a good point to bring up, is that when you look around, there's a lot of I/O boards that all look the same. So how do you know which one? I guess you're saying reputable MiSTer community vendors are probably the ones to approach.
Yeah, so it's it's hard to tell because it's an open source project. Anybody's able to make them. So you could have somebody that's never been in the public eye before hand solder them flawlessly, and how would you know that that's flawless? So I hate kind of saying this, but go with the names that you know, the names that are talked about on all the different podcasts, because they bend over backwards to make sure there's quality control. And I hate alienating the one-offs that are probably excellent, but it's hard for me to give a recommendation unless I know there's consistent quality. Because that's the other thing. Anybody could take their time and make 3 or 4 really good ones, but try making 300 or 400.
Right.
So, yeah.
Especially when you look at the SDRAM component, because if the timings are off on that memory, or it's not good RAM to begin with, you're going to have a lot of instability. So, buying from reputable vendors within the community, I think, is really, really critical. Yes?
Either of you guys aware of any efforts to make physical media playable through MiSTer, like a cartridge slot?
That's not on anybody's radar at the moment, because the amount of work to make that happen, they would rather spend that time elsewhere. So it is absolutely possible, but the biggest limitation of using the DE10 is that it's a general purpose device designed to be a general purpose teaching tool. So if you were to do something like take that chip and make your own version of this, you could have all the pins wired out in a way where you could add a lot of stuff. You could add cartridge adapters, you could do all of this different stuff. But the whole point of centering it around this piece of hardware is it's an education-based tool that's going to be around for a while, and when they come out with the next version, the developers themselves, not me, I'm not smart enough to, but the developers could easily port that code over, whereas if you had a fully custom thing, now everybody's locked to one set of hardware. So, while there's certainly possibilities of that stuff, somebody floated the idea of maybe having a ROM dumper connected, like a USB.
Actually, I guess what comes to mind is like the RetroWorld.
Yeah. So I think that's possible, and I think people, it would just take somebody that's an expert in that to code it in, but it would be very much like the Retron 5 in that you're not reading it off the cartridge, you're saving the ROM to the MiSTer and then saving the save file back to the cart when you're done with it, which is fine. It's just, I just wanted to be clear in the answer.
And that brings up another thing I did not talk about, which is the fact that some of the features that you'll find on software emulation are more difficult to implement on the MiSTer because of the hardware component to it. So save states are not common, although they're becoming more common.
Yeah.
So the NES Core does it now.
Yes, the same developer, Robert Pipe, he loves those.
Mm-hmm.
So especially for testing, because he could go back and test a bug in the same spot. Mm-hmm. So he's been writing that in, and he's been backporting it to other cores. But it's not something that you find on every core. It's just whatever the developer has time to figure that out.
And the arcade cores won't save high scores consistently either. So I love Zaxxon, and I just like to have my score saved, and it was bugging me for a while that it would never do it. Now it does. So that's the other thing with MiSTer is that if it bugs somebody enough, they're going to try to figure out the beauty of open source. Somebody's going to fix it. It won't be me because I can't do that, but somebody at some point will. But you don't have a lot of the creature comforts. If you're in something like RetroArch where there's a universal save state and universal controls and universal rewind and look ahead. None of that stuff is likely going to make it to this because it is much more difficult to implement those kinds of creature comforts. But we're starting to see more. Yeah.
Is anyone looking into attaching real cartridge adapters in order to support cartridges that have not just storage on them, but have, like on Super NES and NES, there were a lot of mappers, and some of them are quite obscure, and emulating that in the FPGA is not necessarily a lot of space, but someone has to do that work for a very obscure mapper. So would that be a motive to support a real-time access to a cartridge?
They've done the opposite. So they've gone and reverse engineered the mapper itself and the chip on the cartridges themselves so that you don't ever need to plug it in. You just get the ROM and it automatically has the accurate recreation of the chip. So it's a very good question, but they attacked it from the opposite side of it and just said, I'm going to I'm going to take this chip, reverse engineer it, and there's been a bunch of code over the years from backporting this stuff, but they've just added the full chip support in, so all you need is the ROM. You don't have to worry about that side. And
here's an example of one of those things where Virtua Racing on the Sega Genesis, where they were able to do that. And it actually benefits because you get, whatever work is done here is going to work on the FPGA for the flash carts that are out there as well. So you'll see some of that cross-pollination. Yeah.
So I have a Bliss 4-play as well. So I'm guessing just if I want to use like the original controllers, just use that through USB, right? And then if I want to use Lightgun games, then use the SNAC.
Yeah.
Right? That way I'm not missing out on anything.
Yeah, and actually it's a good point because I had just researched that for the video I put up last night, and really the polling on the MiSTer is like 1 millisecond. You can set it for that. And the difference, Bob, is very minimal between what you'll get over USB versus a SNAC controller.
Yeah, it's not detectable by a human, impossible. Even by finicky Smash players, there's no way that you'd be able to notice 1 millisecond.
So until the space aliens genetically modify me,
yes,
which is going to be a podcast that we're going to do.
Absolutely.
No modifications for us, but we'll talk about it.
We're already recording it in our heads
right now. Like you really want, it's hard to discern the difference. And just another plug for MiSTerAddOns, and they're not paying us to do this today, but he has a database of how many controllers did he put up on there?
Oh, a lot. I think over 100, I think, at this point.
So he has a database of over 100 controllers and their performance for latency or lag off the USB. And you can sort it by brand, you can sort it by controller type, the connection type. So he tested USB, Bluetooth, the ones that have their special dongles. And so you can load that up and actually see what the actual latency is. And he measured it electrically. He soldered on wires to every one of these controllers to measure that performance.
Did he use it with the Bliss 4-play?
It's on there. Yeah, you should be able to double check it.
Yeah. Take a look at it because I found it to be incredibly helpful. And I used to spend a lot of time trying to measure latency with my iPhone and the high-speed camera. And now I'm like, let's go to his website and point people at it, which is probably a good marketing strategy.
Yeah, I got one of those kits too. I got to do a live stream with them, teaching people how to use it to test their own. But
all right, so like as far as like working with CRTs, are you able to get a VGA output on that?
Yep. All you got to do is just change the MiSTer INI settings, and it'll output 480p VGA. And if you set it to direct mode, it just doubles everything. So it's still no latency at all. It still looks the same. It's still the same refresh rates. And if you add just solid horizontal scan lines, nothing fancy, it looks identical to, as long as your CRT could have the brightness turned up a little bit, but it'll look identical to some fancy RGB monitor.
So if you have a VGA monitor,
yes,
and you want the CRT experience, this will
100% plug it right in,
just plug it like any other
basic
PC.
Scan lines, and it'll look just like a PVM.
Wow.
So if you're able to find one of those VGA monitors in a bargain bin somewhere, you could have yourself what looks like a $1,000 solution for nothing. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, well, there you go. There's a lot of those hanging around. So you had a question.
You could choose which sound chip you would like, and I think there's a few filter options as well. And I believe the default is what the general consensus these days would be the best experience, but I would always argue that whatever your ears like are the best. I'm sure some of the team members, especially Ace, shout out, would probably kill me for saying that, but whatever you want to listen to, you have the choice of. But one very cool thing is listening to like Sonic 3's opening music with the original 2612 chip, and then hitting reset and listening to it with the other chip, or even toggling in real time. You could totally hear a difference if you have headphones on. And it's interesting to see like who grew up with which model, because if you have decent ears, especially if there's any musicians here, like you'd totally be like, that doesn't sound the way it did when I was a kid. So.
And you have here's the option right here in the audio to switch between the YM 2612 and the 3438. And then they have audio filters, Bob, for the Model 1, the Model 2, so you can kind of get close to that sound. But there's no noise, unlike the original sometimes, right?
Right.
What are your favorite enhancements to games that the MiSTer is currently capable of?
That's a good question.
Oh, I got one that's so silly but so awesome. So a lot of arcade shooting games, if you press the button to shoot and you hold to charge. So you can't really set on auto fire because then you lose the charge ability. So you could add another button to it. You just map, when you map the controls, it says map alternate controls, skip all but that one, remap that one and add auto fire to that one. So you could just be holding down the auto fire button, playing your game, and then when you want to charge, you let go and press the original fire button. that's one that just completely changed the experience for a lot of it. And I know it's a silly one, and you can definitely do that with superguns, with with different type of devices and button programmers, but it's just so smooth in the MiSTer. It's so quick to set up.
And for me, it's just the CRT. The CRT thing really blew me away because I didn't realize how good it was. And to have this TV in my house that I didn't even know was capable, it just it was a whole eye-opener of
Oh yeah, there's one more too. I can't believe I forgot about this. So in the 16-bit era of games especially, it happened afterwards too, but there were a lot of effects that developers realized they could use the blurriness of composite video to make happen. Right. And one of the most famous is the waterfall in Sonic the Hedgehog. So you could turn on a blurry filter and make the whole thing look like composite video, but in the MiSTer, you could only blur the layer that's supposed to be blurred. So Sonic is sharp, all the text is sharp, but you go up to the waterfall and the waterfall looks like water, not just rectangular pixels. I can't believe that one slipped my mind. That's usually the #1 thing. Just go right into the setting and blur auto.
It's a composite blend. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, composite blend.
Okay.
Off.
So
what
that's
are the choices?
Yep.
On, and then adaptive. Adaptive blend is the one that tries to figure out which layers. Well, the worst thing that could happen is it does nothing and it just looks sharp, which is a great thing to fail on.
And there's no lag hit for that?
No,
so
zero.
So it just does it.
The only lag hits you get is if you have like a really incompatible capture card and you turn on different settings to add frame buffers. For the scenario of you have a cheap capture card, but you're gaming on like an RGB monitor, crank up the lag to 1,000,000. Who cares? You're not going to notice because it's going through your capture setup. But basic settings, it's so low, it's perfect.
General question on FM, like FM sound chips, is it emulating? I mean, well, it's doing some FPGA work, but how is it reproducing FM sound?
Same way it would on the original. It's just turning itself into the chip, and a lot of the chips are extremely accurate. Not every chip in every console or every arcade board, but most of them out there, there's been decapping done to the point where you could actually make it into another chip and out of the code based off of it.
You think it's going to have a big effect on the collector world?
I think it's really going to vary based on the circumstances. I would look at something like the old Atari games and and the old Nintendo games. There's so much to the experience of the physicality of the artwork and the cartridge, and certainly I think it might perhaps some older computer games might drive the value up higher if people see these games and like, oh, I would love to have an actual copy of that original Ultima or something. I could see that. So no, I don't think so. I think it does fill a role though for people that don't have a lot of space. And I know I'm harping on this RGB thing, but I think for those who had all these systems, because I started like acquiring all these systems that I always wanted to play with before the MiSTer, and I have a TV, I've got a switch box, I got all this stuff, but it's so much more convenient to just load this thing up and have everything in one spot. But no, I think if anything, I think it might drive values up to some degree as people rediscover some of these things. Very easy. And although I run a tech channel, I am not a coder. I don't know how to solder. Well, I've tried to, but it's like you would watch me to like just burn myself and destroy things. And I had bought the MiSTer. So Bob and Smoke Monster told me to go buy a MiSTer. So I bought the board. I was sitting on it for months because I was like, this is another project. And I took it out in the course of an hour-and-a-half live stream. I got the whole thing working. So there's one download you do from their website, and then once you get the script going, it just loads it all up with everything. You do have to find the ROMs for a lot of the stuff like you would normally, but it's really quick, and it's a really fun project to tinker with because you are building something. So it's got that PC build kind of thing to it. So I think I was surprised by how easy it was, and in some ways it felt a little more intuitive than installing. The Raspberry Pi, what's the Pi image, RetroPie. That's an easy thing to get started with, but this felt even easier because there's no operating system really that's in between you and the game. It's just menus that you're navigating as you saw. So it's a real fun thing to get started with, and there's a great community around it too, that are eager to welcome you to the house of MiSTer. The more converts, the better I think is how it goes.
And if I may add too, sorry, but the community of developers is awesome. but we would never have any of these cores if it wasn't for any of the developers that are doing it. So if your situation allows and you use the MiSTer and you love it, consider throwing whatever the minimum is to the developer's Patreon. If you can only do a few, do whichever, supporting your cores. But I try to link up with every one of them, because it's just, I think once you start to understand what goes into these, you realize how much work and how much effort it is. And no one's making $1 million making MiSTer cores.
Right.
So you're paying for dev tools, you're paying for a monitor to test the analog output on. So I always just try to politely remind people, if your situation allows and you love this thing as much as I do, try supporting the developers somehow. Or if you can't, retweet, tell your friends, maybe somebody else can. That's always really helpful too. There's an official Discord, there are sub-Discords. I would just start by reading through the GitHub and then just kind of see, I think it's the official MiSTer Discord. You just go in there, polite, say you're a noob, and they'll treat you really nicely. But it's, obviously if you go in guns blaring, you get what you get. But,
be nice. There's also there's an official MiSTer message board. So that's a really useful search area just to see what kind of problems people have encountered. There's also a Facebook group that's pretty active. So there's a bunch of different ways the community connects to each other. But I'll tell you what, of all the things, I rarely seek help, because for me, just the things that I want to just work. So it's been really really good. And a lot of the vendors that are reputable in the community are also really eager to, because obviously they want you to buy some stuff from them, but they also they're into this, and they want to help spread the gospel too. So the DE10 Nano is about, depending on current supply and demand, whatever, about $170 for the baseboard, about another $50 or so, $60 for the SDRAM module. So you're in the door for around $250, give or take, and that's the bare minimum. If you got everything, you're in the $400-ish territory. You can buy one that's like pre-configured on a lot of the vendor sites. I started with the DE10 and the RAM module, and then I bought the USB hub just for convenience. But I had my own, you all have USB hubs laying around. You don't need a big fancy one, just a regular one. So I did that for a while, but I had all this stuff hanging off, and I wanted to streamline it.
Yeah, actually, I had just Googled that. I used the link on your site. It's $173.
173, there you go. So that's for the DE10 Nano. And like I said, there's a lot you can run on the Nano from the get-go. So you can take a look. I did a video on it a while ago. I think there's a few other resources about what runs just on the bare board. And there's a lot that you can get started with there.
And the only other thing, too, I always forget, the USB port that you use to connect peripherals is micro USB.
That's right.
So if you're going bare bones, there's like a $6 self-powered USB hub on Amazon that works totally fine for basic controllers. It's a very worthy $6 investment, even if you get a fancy kit, because you never know if you need to do some troubleshooting or something like that.
And it's USB 2, so you don't even need like a faster USB 3. And I would actually, there's a good point about the self-powered. You'll notice on my power strip here, I have 2 plugs. So I power my USB hub separately from the MiSTer itself, because the MiSTer is only running with 5 volts, 1.5 amps or whatever. So it's not getting a lot of power to the board. So when you've got hard drives like I've got connected, you'll want to power your hub on its own so that you can have enough power to run your peripherals and the MiSTer too. Just like a Pi, same problem. All right. Well, I thank you all. Was this helpful? Was this good? Great. Excellent. Well done.
Thank you, sir.
It's always a pleasure.
Hell yeah.
And Bob, where can people find you?
RetroRGB on everything.
And I'm Lon.TV, and thank you all for stopping by.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Hot Sauce and Video Games, Brian Parker, Chris Allegretta, Tom Albrecht, Thomas Anfang, Jim Tanis, and Handheld Obsession. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to Lon.TV/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/s.